Good morning, everybody. My name's David. I'm one of the leaders here. That was a great word that we had from Stuart there, and it's particularly good for me because you've all got to pray for me and the others, and I'm always up for people praying for me. And there was one line in particular that I noted down, and it was that line that when the Lord said through Stuart, "I am a covenant-keeping God." And I just want you to keep that in your mind with what I've got to share this morning. And covenant is a word that we don't use perhaps very often outside of church circles. It's used in legal world, but it's about a promise. So God is a promise-keeping God. This morning, we're going to continue our study on the book of Esther. And the thing that I feel that the Lord wants to remind us of this morning is his sovereignty and his providence in our lives. And my title this morning is Over All Things. And I'll come back to that in a little bit later. A couple of weeks ago, Beth unpacked part of the story of Esther about a young Jewish girl who rose from obscurity to become the Queen of Persia. And Marcus gave us a quick recap last week and then encouraged us to operate in faith and obedience. And I don't want to spend too long going back over where we've been for the last couple of weeks, but I would like to give a bit of an overview of the story, and then we're going to try and look at a specific part. Now, I'm sure we've been studying this for a couple of weeks. I'm sure you've all read the book of Esther, but just in case, and for those here that might be unfamiliar, here's my sort of background and overview of this book of Esther. The story dates from about 2,500 years ago, and we're in the Persian Empire under King Xerxes. He's a powerful leader. He's fairly ruthless. He's sometimes a bit rash. He's a bit of a womanizer, and he likes to drink and to feast. But he was also a historical leader that wanted to leave his mark in the world. And he tried to expand his kingdom a lot during his reign. He also built things, including a massive palace in the city of Susa, which is in modern-day Iraq. And, you know, parts of Xerxes' palace still exist in Iran. So if you go to this place in Iran, you can actually walk through something called the Gate of All Nations, or Xerxes' Gate, and it's this huge part of what is left of his palace. The reason I mention that is I really like it when there is still a physical link that exists to something so old and ancient. A physical thing that kind of shows us that this book that we're looking at isn't just myth or fairy tale. Back when I was about 20 or so, Mary and we went to Turkey on holiday one year, and we went and walked around Ephesus. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but these are the streets that the Apostle Paul lived in for 3 years, preached in. And I love that thought of walking through that place when it physically exists. Don't tell anybody, but I actually pinched a little bit of pottery from the ground in Ephesus. The Turkish authorities were pretty lax 25 years ago. You could climb over anything. But if you booked a trip to Iran, you could walk through tomorrow Xerxes' Gate. Ephesus in Turkey is probably a better place to visit. And in fact, I'd advise you not to book a trip to Iran. I had a quick look, and the British government advises against that. But this is a real place that we're looking at, and we're looking at real events that are described. And so at this time, the Jewish people, they've already been overthrown by the Babylonians. They're living in exile, lost their homeland. And then the Persian Empire has actually defeated the Babylonians. And now some of the Jews are slowly beginning to return to Jerusalem, but the majority of them are scattered throughout the Persian Empire. And they are basically what we'd call an ethnic minority in the land that they are living in. They're ethnic minority in a foreign land, and they're generally looked down upon and persecuted. And Esther is one of these Jewish minorities. She was orphaned. She was brought up by her cousin Mordecai in this capital city of Susa. And they did not compromise their faith, but they would have needed to kind of keep their heads down a little bit. And in fact, we read in the story that they don't immediately tell everybody of their Jewish heritage. Mordecai lived in a faithful service to the king of Persia, so he was an official in and around the palace, but he hadn't forgotten his heritage or his identity. And there's a bit of scripture in Jeremiah, and I think Mordecai and Esther were really living out this command. So this is written in Jeremiah 29, verses 4 to 7. So this is after Israel had been defeated and by the Babylonians, it says this: "This is what the Lord of the heavens' armies, the God of Israel, says to all the captives who he has exiled to Babylon from Jerusalem. Build homes and plan to stay. Plant gardens and eat the food they produce. Marry and have children. Find spouses for them so that they will have grandchildren. Multiply, do not dwindle away. And work for the peace and prosperity of the city where I send you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, for its welfare will determine your welfare." So even in exile, God is still at work to ensure that his people are not going to dwindle away. They might be living in, as I say, these foreign lands, but God is still overseeing something. So then, long story short, King Xerxes banishes his wife, and the search is made for a suitably beautiful replacement. And there's a bit of scripture that when I was reading this, it did just make me smile slightly, that his advisors come to him and they say, right, we've got an idea, we need a new queen, we're going to go out over the whole land, the whole kingdom of Persia, we're going to gather every single young, beautiful virgin we can find, we're going to spend a year making them even more beautiful, and then you can pick your queen. And there's this really little understated verse that then says, the king says, "This advice appealed to the king." I bet it did. Esther is then put forward as a possible suitor, and ultimately she is chosen by the king to become queen. And while she is in the palace, while she's part of the king's harem, she stays in touch with her cousin Mordecai. And then I'm starting really looking at chapter 3. I'm not going to read lots of it because it's too much to read through. But then enters Haman into the story. And this is the part and a little bit of the story I'd like to focus on this morning. So Haman, I'll just read the little bit from chapter 3. It says here, after these events, so this is after Esther has become queen, King Xerxes honours the man, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honour higher than the other nobles. All the royal officials in the king's gate knelt down and paid honour to Haman. So at this moment in time, things are working out really well for Haman. He's basically just like a king's official. He's a noble of the land, and he's worked his way up to basically be the king's right-hand man. Things are going exceptionally well for him. He's the noble above all nobles. The king has commanded that people have to kneel before him. He's climbed the royal ranks. He's amassed money, power. He's now got political influence. We find out later on that he's got 10 sons, which back in that culture and day was an amazing legacy for his family. So he had basically achieved everything he could to secure for himself the future of his tribe and family. We'll see later on that he wasn't above a bit of manipulation and manoeuvring to get where he wanted and to get ahead, but he had acquired everything he possibly could at that time to obtain security in his life, and he seemingly had it made. And 2,500 years later, we as people are really still not that dissimilar. Marcus reflected last week that many people work to achieve success, to fill up a bank account, to obtain position, to obtain status. And ultimately, all of this is with the aim of achieving a sense of security, to somehow sleep easy at night. And there's nothing wrong with that to a point. But this morning, I want to ask ourselves this question: where are we looking for our sense of identity and security? Is it from achievement in our job? Is it from success in our business? Is it from position and standing among our peers? Is it our popularity amongst our friends, the number of likes we might get on Facebook, the followers on Instagram? There's nothing wrong with success or money. And there's nothing wrong with working hard to try to achieve those things. The Lord wants us to prosper and do well. He wants to bless us. But it's about our heart being in the right place as we pursue those things. When our heart is aligned with the Lord, when we're aligned with him, he is for us, and he may well bless us with our work and our business and our relationships. The problem arises when the pursuit of success or money or vain ambition becomes our sole focus, or our driving force, or the main desire that we have in life. You know, throughout all of our lives, we have to choose our priorities. God, spouse, children, family, ministry, work. You know, we could perhaps argue over the order of some of those things, but the one that I can tell you that I know to be true is that our relationship with God should be our first and foremost priority. Because when we get that bit right, it sets the course for everything else. When the posture or when the position of our heart is towards God, it influences all these other areas of our life. When we get that bit right, it changes the way that we think. It changes the way that we make decisions. It changes the way that we treat other people. Scripture says, seek first the kingdom of God and everything else will be added to you. So I just want to move on now and see the fate of Haman. And I'm going to try to summarise now quite an amazing sort of string of events. So Haman is in this really high position, so much so that the king has sent out this decree that people are to bow and honour to him when they're seen. And Mordecai, who we remember is Esther's cousin, who's out and around, he won't bow to Haman. And the reason that he won't do that is, as a Jew, he believes he can only bow and worship the one true God. So it's his faith that stops him operating in that way and bowing and effectively worshipping Haman. And this really annoys Haman. And then Haman finds out that Mordecai is a Jew, and that's why he's not doing it. So he chats a bit more. And it happens that Haman's family line goes back to a tribe that are really anti-Israel, anti the Jews. So he's actually got a bias and a kind of a hatred for the Jews anyway. And then he's got this Jew right in front of him every day that isn't bowing and scraping like everybody else. So not content with maybe just killing killing Mordecai, he develops this plot that he's going to go to the king, and basically he says to the king, you know, there's this group of people living in and around your kingdom, and they don't honour you properly because of their God. And he says, I'd like to kill them all. And the king goes, all right then, do that. And so a royal decree is issued that on a certain month, in a certain year, about a year's time, that all of the Jewish people throughout the kingdom on this one day, there's permission granted for people to kill them, slaughter them, and take whatever their goods are as plunder. And this decree is issued around the kingdom. It's also just quickly mentioned, because I'll come back to it later, the date is decided by effectively casting lots or rolling a die, which is called a pur. So that's how Haman dictated the date. It was like his bit of luck. Oh, when shall we kill them all? It'll be that date. So then we could fast forward a little bit. And Mordecai learns about this plot. He's obviously devastated. The Jewish communities around the whole province hear about it. They're in mourning. We're all going to die. We've got a year left. You know, this is terrible. What's going to happen? So Mordecai asks Esther, who's now become queen, to talk to the king and see what she can do about this situation. Esther immediately asks all of the people to pray and to fast for her before she goes to the king. And Beth has already told us and explained some of that little part of the story a couple of weeks ago. But Esther is very, I'd say, clever in terms of how she then operates with the king. So first of all, she goes to see him. He allows her to come into his presence. She risks her life to go into his presence. But the king then says, well, what is it you want? And he actually goes on to say, you can have anything up to half my kingdom and I'd give it to you. So he's kind of opened the door. And at that point, if it were me, I'd probably just have blurted out everything because I'm a bit like that. But Esther says, can I come to a feast that I've prepared and bring Haman with you? So the king says, okay. And he kind of knows there's something else still to come, but they go to a feast, they drink, they have merry time. Haman then goes home, and he's like loving it even more, because not only is he now in favour with the king, but he's like, I am the only person that got invited to feast with the Queen of Persia, Esther. And so he goes home. It says he was in high spirits. He had probably had a few wines, and he walks out. And who does he walk past? Mordecai, who then refuses to bow and scrape to him. And it says that he kind of gets over himself with that a little bit, carries on home, but he then goes home and he says to his family and to his friends, he starts boasting. He says, do you know how amazing I am, basically? He said, I've got 10 sons. I've got stacks of money. I've got this huge estate. I'm the second in command to the king. And not only that, I've been to eat with the king and Queen Esther, and I've been invited again tomorrow. So at that first dinner, Esther still doesn't actually disclose what it is she wants to say. But she says to the king, please come and eat with me again tomorrow and bring Haman. So Haman at this point thinks he's got it all, but he then says, but do you know what's really riving me? Despite all of that, on the way home, I walked past Mordecai and he still isn't bowing or scraping to me. And so his wife and his friend says, you know what you should do? Just have him killed. Don't wait until this date that's come in. Just have him killed tomorrow. So he says, I'm going to do that. I'll speak to the king. The king does anything for me. So he builds this huge gallows. And there's actually the word that's used in the original Hebrew, it's either a huge gallows on his property, or it's actually a huge spike to impale someone on. So either way, it's pretty nasty. The spike sounds even more grisly, to be honest, than the hanging. But this is built. And he's so confident that this is what's going to happen. He builds this in his garden. The next day, so he's gone on his way to see the king the next day, and he thinks, right, I'm going to ask for this. Mordecai will be dead. That's dealt with. But that night, the king doesn't sleep, can't sleep. So he says, can someone bring me the Royal Chronicles and read to me? We do that, don't we? When we can't sleep, we read, maybe helps us go off. So someone brings the Royal Chronicles, they read a story. Now, they happen to choose a bit in the book that is about a time when Mordecai, a few years prior, had warned the king about a plot to kill him. So the king can't sleep. He has this read to him, and then he says, this guy Mordecai, I remember that. What did I do to honour him when he saved me from being assassinated? And they say, you didn't do anything. And he's like, what? This guy needs to be honoured. And so he says, right, who's here? Who's in the court that I can discuss this with? And who does it happen to be? But Haman has made his way. So he calls Haman in. He says, Haman, I really want to honour somebody who is, I want to give him all the honour I can. And Haman thinks, he's talking about me. Of course he is. So Haman says, what I think you should do is get one of the royal robes, put it on this person, get one of the royal horses, march him right through the city. So he's thinking, I'm describing the events that are about to happen to me. He said, and that will show the king's honour on this person. The king then says, that's a really good idea. Could you go and do that to Mordecai? Can you imagine what Haman must have been thinking in that moment? So he then has to go off, put the royal robe on, get on the horse, lead Mordecai through the streets, basically saying, this man is honoured above all. The king is delighted in this man. So the tables have now really turned. The next day is the second dinner with Esther and with the king. Haman's invited. He's got no choice but to go. He's already said that he's going. But by this point, Mordecai has become quite in the king's favour. In the dinner, again, long story short, the king says to Esther, what was it that you wanted to ask me? And she said, well, me and my people, so she's basically telling him she's a Jew, are all going to be slaughtered on this date because somebody put a plot together to kill and exterminate my people. And the king is outraged. He doesn't want to have his wife killed. And he said, well, who would have done this? And she said, this guy Haman, who's sitting at us with dinner. So the king is fuming. He marches out the room. In that moment, Haman realises I'm in serious trouble. He jumps to the feet, probably begging at Esther's feet to say, please don't do this, don't harm me. At which point the king comes back in again. And then he's like, I can't believe this. Now you're throwing yourself all over my wife because he shouldn't have been anywhere near her. So the king immediately throws him, and someone says, what shall we do with Haman? Oh, Haman happens to have a gallows set up in front of his garden. And so Haman hangs from the gallows that he has built for Mordecai. Sorry, that was a long story, but I just needed to kind of bring us to that point. And then, even more miraculously, the decree that is given to kill all the Jews can't be taken back. It's a royal decree, and in those times it has become law. So on that day, there is a law already set in place that the Jews can be slaughtered. But what the king says to Mordecai is, why don't you write another law, a decree, whatever you think appropriate? And Mordecai writes a rule to say that on that date, the Jewish people are allowed to come together to defend themselves and to actually fight back and kill anybody that might try to hurt them. So again, there's a complete reversal of the plot. And that's what happens, and the Jews are saved, and in fact they actually slaughter their enemies on the day that was planned for that other way around to happen. And then finally, Mordecai establishes something called the Purim celebration. So Purim was that word pure for the dice or the lots that determine the date. And Mordecai sets another law in place that the Jewish people will always remember this celebration of their victory as the Purim feast. And Jews still to this day celebrate Purim. In fact, it's coming up really soon. It's usually around about end of February, beginning of March. And they remember that as the day that God turned the tables and rescued them. Here's an interesting fact about the book of Esther. It's the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God. In the original Hebrew, God is not mentioned by name, not by title, not by pronoun. God is not mentioned at all. But I think we can see that God's fingerprints are over the whole of the events that unfold. And so one way of looking at that string of events that occurred is we could say, what a coincidence that Esther was picked to be queen. What a coincidence that King Xerxes couldn't sleep. What a coincidence that when his servants picked up a copy of the Royal Chronicles, they just happened to read the chapter about Mordecai saving the king's life. Going back even further, what a coincidence that Mordecai happened to overhear the plot about the assassination attempt on the king. What a coincidence that Haman happened to be the person that the king wanted to discuss the reward with for the person he wanted to honour. What a coincidence that Mordecai then ended up being the person that had to parade through the streets Haman had to be the person to parade through the streets with Mordecai. What a coincidence that there is this amazing and ironic reversal of fate. God is never mentioned, but the writer of this book is inviting us to look for God's fingerprints. They're written all over it in these series of events. God is the author and perfecter of the entire thing. He aligns people, timings, events perfectly, and he turns things on their head. God is never mentioned, but he is never once out of the picture. It's so poetically perfect. Everything Haman had planned for the Jews ended up happening to him. And without any human striving or manipulation, Mordecai was then raised up to the highest position in the land. He effectively became the prime minister alongside the king. And the message that I feel that the Lord wants us to hear this morning is that God is in control. The Bible explains it as God being sovereign, fully in charge of all things, ordering the events and purposes of the lives of those who love him and those that don't. And if we can really understand and believe this fact, it can free us from worry and anxiety. God is sovereign, so even I can't mess it up. God is sovereign, so even you can't mess it up. God isn't in heaven pacing around with worry every time something goes wrong on the earth. He's not in heaven thinking, oh no, what is David doing now? I didn't expect that. That's really surprised me. God knows what I'm going to do wrong. He knows when I'm going to mess up, and he's got my back. And he's got your back. The Lord is on your side. He's in supreme control of every situation you will face, whether that's at work, with your family, with your friends, whatever the situation, God is in control. Romans 8:28 says, and we know all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. A couple of weeks ago, Gus gave a prophetic word at the end of a service, and I'll just read a little bit of it. But God, through that word, through Gus, it said, I see you. I hold the earth in my hands. I know the coming tomorrow. Why are you worrying? And the words that really stayed with me for the last couple of weeks was that word, I see you. It wasn't, I see you, you're in trouble. It was, I see you. I care for you. I understand. And this morning, God says, I see you. I have you. He has you. He has your story. He has your circumstances. He has you in his hand. He is over all things. So we can relax. Spurgeon put it really well. Spurgeon said this: the sovereignty of God is the pillow upon which the child of God rests his head at night, giving perfect peace. God's sovereignty is foundational to our understanding of Christian peace. We can know that everything that has happened, is happening, will happen, is under God's control, and therefore we don't need to have fear about what will come to pass. God always will be in control over his creation, so we can sleep well tonight. Just going to end with this is in 1 Chronicles 29. I think the guys might put it up behind me. 1 Chronicles 29 verse 10. David praised the Lord in the presence of the whole assembly, saying, Praise be to you, Lord, the God of our father Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. Yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendour, for everything in heaven and earth is yours. Yours, Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all. Wealth and honour come from you. You are the ruler over all things. In your hands are strength and power to exalt, to give strength to all. Now, our God, we give you thanks and praise in your glorious name. I believe the Lord wants to remind all of us this morning that he is over all things in our life, and he can bring about change in an instant. Mordecai had been in sackcloth and ashes and mourning, expecting to die, and in an instant of one night and God's intervention, things were flipped on their head. I don't have time to go fully into it this morning, and I have gone a little over, I'm sorry. But you know, Stuart mentioned that word about God is a God of covenant, that he keeps his covenant, that he keeps his promises. God made a covenant with the people of Israel, with the Jews. Even when they were scattered, he kept his hand on them. He rescued them. And we see that time and time again over the centuries, even into our recent time with the nation of Israel being re-established. No other people group in history have ever been displaced from a nation for 2,000 years and yet been brought back. It's because of the faithfulness of God. Do you know, even the Hebrew language, it's an ancient language that had died out and not been spoken for 2,000 years. It was only used in like religious readings by a few people that knew it. 100 years ago, no one spoke Hebrew. Now it's the most spoken language in Israel. Again, no other ancient language has ever come back to life in the history of mankind, apart from due to the faithfulness of God. The Lord made a covenant and a promise with the people of Israel, and he would not leave them, and he keeps his word. And you know, because of Jesus, because of what he has done and that relationship that we have with him, us Gentiles, non-Jews, us Christians, we're grafted in to that family. And that covenant and that promise is just as reliable to us. So we can trust him. We need to remember to celebrate all that he has done for us so that we can have confidence and peace about what he will do for us. I don't know if the worship team want to come back up, but I really feel this morning, I know I've gone through that quite quickly, but God's hand was over that entire circumstance and events, and God's hand is on our lives. But what Esther did at the beginning was she asked the people to pray and fast for her. And that's what God wants for us. He wants us to just draw close to him. Some of that prophetic word that we had from Stuart, the Lord said, come close to me and I'll bless you and I'll keep you. And so I just want to encourage you this morning, if you want to come and pray about something, that you can pray about something this morning and you can leave it in the sovereign hands of God, knowing that he has got your back, that he has got it covered, and allow him to work out his purposes in your life. Thanks, guys.